This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. We are in Duskmourn preview season right now, and in the week before the set review starts, which will start on Friday, by the way, I like to do a video where I look at the set's mechanics, archetypes, and the like, and sort of give you my early thoughts about them and how they'll play in the format. So that's what we'll be doing today. Before I get into the topic of this video, though, I do want to remind you that if you become a channel member or a patron, you get some set review related perks. Right now, my channel members and patrons have access to my ongoing set review notes for the format, kind of my early thoughts about each of the cards that have been previewed so far. And then at the end of the set review, I give you a spreadsheet that has all of my grades for all of the cards in the set. So if either of those sounds interesting to you, check out the description where you can find a way to become a channel member or a patron. All right, so let's go ahead and dive right in with a look at the mechanics. So we've got one returning mechanic, like entirely returning. It's a mechanic we've seen a couple of times before. And then we have several new mechanics, although many of them are sort of spins on things we've seen before. But let's go ahead and start with the returning mechanic, which is Delirium. So this is a graveyard threshold-like mechanic, although unlike Threshold and the like, it doesn't care how many cards are in your graveyard, it cares how many card types are in your graveyard. And once you have 4 card types among cards in your graveyard, you get some sort of bonus. Like on Spineseeker Centipede, it becomes a much better creature, which is nice because this looks like a pretty good common to me as, you know, a 3-mana 2/1 search up a land. Usually plays fine, and then it actually becomes a relevant body in the mid to late game, or sometimes earlier. There are 2 dedicated Delirium decks in the format in black-green and red-green. I'll talk more about, you know, how they're different from each other later on in the video. And there's a few things going on in this set that make Delirium nice. First of all, there's a lot of graveyard stuff. I mean, this set is a spooky one, as is usually the case in those sets. Got a lot of graveyard stuff going on, and Delirium is the main thing, really, the main graveyard mechanic. But there's other graveyard stuff going on, too. And the other thing is, this is an enchantment-focused set. So you have enchantment creatures. So, you know, usually with Delirium, you're pretty excited about artifact creatures, because one artifact creature gets you halfway to Delirium, while an enchantment creature can get you halfway there, too, all on its own. And then, obviously, you know, just milling lands and stuff like that works out, too. There just looks like there's a lot of ways to enable Delirium, especially in green. So it looks like a good mechanic for the set, and, you know, it's a fun one. I like things being more than just raw numbers of cards in graveyards. I liked Delirium when we first saw it in Shadows over Innistrad, and I've liked it since every time it's returned, and it looks good here. All right, let's talk about the new mechanics now, and let's talk about the one that I feel like is like the headliner mechanic for this set more than the rest, and that is rooms/doors. So room is a new enchantment subtype. And these are cards that have 2 sides. Each side is a door. So think of it like a room. Each room has 2 doors. I mean, some rooms have more than 2. But in this world of Duskmourn, where you're trapped in this giant haunted house, basically, every room has 2 doors. And the cool thing about these is that they are modal. But unlike a lot of modal cards we've seen before, where you like cast one side and you get that side, and that's all you ever have, these are double-faced modal cards. Well, they're not double-faced. They have both things on one face, but you choose one side of the card to cast. So in the case of Glassworks, you can cast it as Glassworks for 2 generic and a red, or you can cast it as Shattered Yard for 4 generic and a red. Whichever side you choose to cast, you can unlock the other door. So technically, when you pay for one of the sides and put it into play, cast it, you unlock a door. And then you can, at any time later in the game, unlock the other door by paying the mana cost. You can only do it at sorcery speed. So each of these rooms has 2 doors. And the reason I keep mentioning doors and unlocking them is because that shows up in some other mechanics in the set. And there's also an archetype in the set that's supposed to be most focused on these doors. But, you know, some of these look really good to me because they have one side that would be a playable card anyway. The best example of this at the time when I'm doing this video anyway, is Glassworks, which is the one I already mentioned, because it's 3 mana deal 4 on one side, which is a playable limited card all the time. And then later in the game, you can open the other door, unlock the other door, I guess is the technical term, to also have Shattered Yard happen. So, and with Shattered Yard going at the beginning of your end step, it does 1 damage to each opponent. That's obviously not, like, good. Like, if this was just the Shattered Yard side, it would be an F, right? Like, that's all it would be. But on the other side, you have, like, a C+ level removal spell, which is, again, a card will always make the cut, especially in a set where enchantments matter, and this is an enchantment. And so basically what you have is, like, a good removal spell that has this upside that you're going to unlock later in the game when you have nothing better to do with your mana. And that doesn't sound amazing, right? But it is value stapled to an already playable, more than playable, really, removal spell. So, these are really cool because of their modality. And as is usually the rule of thumb in this day and age in Limited, if neither side can impact the board in a big way, I have a feeling these won't be that good, right? Like, the ones that just sort of give you effects that don't impact the board, the best example, or worst example, however you want to look at it, of the ones that are previewed so far when I'm recording this, is Central Elevator and Promising Stairs. One side tutors up a room, and the other side is an alternate win condition, which will win you the game if you unlock enough doors. So, like, that's cool, but it's horrible in Limited. Like, you just can't spend 4 mana on a tutor that's this narrow and hope to win the game, and, you're just not going to pull it off. This is a card that's really there for other formats where people really want to go crazy with doors, and the blue-red deck is a door deck, but I still don't see a card like that working out. You really need one of the sides to be able to give you something up front that impacts the board, like removal, or a bounce spell, or a creature token, and then it kind of doesn't matter what the other side does, it's just extra value stapled to the card. And, that's what we have with Glassworks. Another one we have it with is Bottomless Pool, for example, where one side is a bounce spell. For 1 blue, the other side is an effect that will draw you cards later in the game. Those are the designs that will be really good and Limited. Next, let's look at a mechanic in the set that is related to rooms and doors, and it's basically just a spin on what we've seen before, except a spooky version, and that is Eerie. So this is something that triggers anytime you unlock a door or an enchantment enters a battlefield under your control. So it's Constellation with door stuff added to it. For example, Infernal Phantom is a 4 mana 2/3 with Eerie, gets +2/+0 whenever an enchantment you control enters, and whenever you fully unlock a room. So you don't have to fully unlock a room, by the way. I think I said door a minute ago. Just unlocking a door doesn't do it. You have to unlock both sides to get the Eerie trigger, which is substantially harder. The good news is, in a door entering the battlefield will trigger this anyway because it's an enchantment. So it probably would be too good if you got like +4/+0 just by playing a door. So, probably makes sense. But the point is, Eerie triggers when enchantments enter and when you fully unlock a room. That means both doors are unlocked. And there are lots of cards with Eerie in this set. There are a couple of decks in the format, blue-black and blue-white, that are especially interested in doing stuff with Eerie. But as you can see on Infernal Phantom, it's also on red cards. It's something you'll find throughout the set. And I like Infernal Phantom, if we want to talk about the card, because 4 mana, 2/3, that when it dies does damage equal to its power to any target's probably already playable. Like, setting up 2-for-1s isn't hard, and if you can make this thing's power go up, which, by the way, it can trigger more than once a turn, so, if you play a door and then fully unlock both rooms, for example, you do get +4/+0, so, that is pretty nice. So enchantments really matter in the set. You've got a bunch of enchantment creatures, and then you've got a new enchantment subtype in door, so it really doesn't look that hard to trigger. The format has lots and lots of enchantments. So speaking of enchantment creatures, another thing to look at, though, it's not technically its own mechanic, but it is something that's in the set that I think is pretty powerful, and that is most creatures that have the Glimmer subtype, all of them are enchantment creatures, but most of them, when they die, come back to the battlefield, but they're not creatures anymore. So it's sort of like a reverse version of what we're used to with gods, where you get to a certain point and they become creatures. With these, they are creatures first, but then when they die, they come back and they give you the other effect that they have. Like, Enduring Innocence is this 3 mana 2/1 lifelinker, and whenever one or more other creatures you control with power 2 or less enters, you get to draw a card. That's, pretty nice little effect. The body it's on isn't great, but the fact is you can trade this body off for whatever and then get it back and still have this effect on the board, which is pretty close to a 2-for-1. It remains to be seen. Right now, all the ones that have this effect where they come back and aren't creatures anymore are rares, so there may just be one of each of these, but I did think they were worth mentioning. The next mechanic we should look at is Manifest Dread. This is a new take on Manifest, which we've seen before. It's a mechanic that puts a card into play, usually from your library as a 2/2, face down, and then you can turn it up at any time for its mana cost if it's a creature. Manifest Dread is a way better version of Manifest, and this is because it lets you look at the top 2 cards of your library, and you put one onto the battlefield face down as a 2/2, and the other into your graveyard. So, for example, you've got Unsettling Twins, which is 3 generic and a white for a 2/2 that manifests Dread when it enters. So, what makes Manifest Dread better than Manifest? Well, it just does more. So this is a format where graveyards matter. You know, Black-White, for example, is a Reanimator deck. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And you have a couple of Delirium decks, and there's just graveyard value all around. So, these not only give you card selection, which increases the chances that you actually put a creature face down, it also puts a card into your graveyard every time. And it gives you card selection. So, like, it just does a ton. So, you know, Unsettling Twins looks like an excellent common to me. You know, one of the better ones in the set, probably. It's a little expensive these days to maybe get that title at 4 mana, but it's 4 mana for 2/2/2s, which is always a playable card in Limited. But that other 2/2 you get has so much more upside than like a random 2/2 token, which is what we're used to getting on this kind of card, because you get to put a card in the graveyard, and if you put a creature into play face down, you can threaten to turn it face up later. There's also some interesting sort of mind games that can go on with this, because if you put a creature into the graveyard with the half that doesn't get put into play face down, when you look at the top 2, your opponent kind of thinks that what you have is a creature, but maybe it's not. I mean, it probably is, unless you really needed a creature in your graveyard for Delirium. But, you know, they look at the creature you put in the graveyard, and they look at what you have in play. Like, it's going to create some interesting feelings when you're playing, when somebody manifests Dread and puts a creature into the graveyard, which I think is cool. But, you know, you get this card selection, you get a 2/2 with a bunch of upside, and so when it's costed correctly, I think Manifest Dread looks really, really good, like on a card like Unsettling Twins. Next, let's look at Survival. So, Survival is a mechanic that only appears on creatures who are survivors. The survivor type came back in this set. Makes sense, right? And a card with Survival has an effect that triggers at the beginning of your second main phase if that creature is tapped. So, Cynical Loner, for example, is a 2 mana 3/1. Can't be blocked by Glimmers, which will come up sometimes. But it has a survival trigger where you get to search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard and then shuffle. So if it manages to, you know, there are lots of ways to tap it. The most natural way, the most organic way is to just attack with it. And, you know, this is a 3/1, so there's a decent chance it doesn't survive. But it does create some interesting decisions for your opponent. Like, you don't always trade with a 2 mana 3/1 with your 2 mana 2/2. But when it's a card with Survival, you've got to think about it a little bit. You know, this particular survival trigger isn't insanely strong, but as I've been saying in this video, there's graveyard stuff going on in the format, so getting to tutor up any card and put it into your graveyard has more value than it normally would because of Delirium. Maybe it's a recursive creature or whatever. But there are other ways to tap creatures in this format, too. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like they gave us a bunch of vehicles. There's like a couple at higher rarities as of when I'm recording this. Vehicles would have been pretty sweet with Survival, but it doesn't look like we have a ton of those. But there are some cards that just, you know, give you a bonus for tapping your creatures. Like there's a 2 mana 2/1 where when you attack with it, you can tap any number of other creatures and it gets +1/+1 for each one you tap. You know, that card in most sets wouldn't be like amazing, and it may not be amazing here either, but it can enable these survival decks to get their triggers going without having to send their creature into combat. And I'm sure there'll be other ways to do that seeded throughout the format, which will make it a little more interesting than just turning your creatures sideways. All right, so the last mechanic that appears on multiple cards, you know, we also have like land cycling, there's Convoke on one card. These days, they put random mechanics into sets on a few cards, and I never cover those in these videos because, you know, they're only on a few cards. But the last mechanic that's on at least a cycle of Mythic Rares is Impending. And it's kind of a new take on Suspend. It works substantially differently, but that was the inspiration for it. So let's look at Overlord of the Mistmoors, which is probably one of the biggest bombs in the set. Normally, you can play it as a 5 generic mana and 2 white for a 6/6. And when it enters or attacks, you create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. So it has all of these Overlords have Impending. There's one in each color. They're all mythic. And they all have attack and enters triggers, like Titans. That's also sort of the inspiration for them. But then it has Impending 4, and that means you can pay 2 generic and 2 white, and if you cast it that way instead, it enters with 4 time counters on it, and it isn't a creature until the last is removed. At the beginning of your end step, remove a time counter from it. So the big thing that's different from Suspend is that this does enter the battlefield when you Impending, and that means if you pay 2 generic and 2 white on turn 4, you get those 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying right away. So, that's a pretty good rate too. And then later, this becomes a creature and it can start triggering that over and over again. So there is some interesting stuff going on with these, partly because there's enchantment removal in this set. And so if you Impending this and you're counting on it coming down later, there's a chance it won't. Your opponent might get rid of it. Granted, in this case, you're still coming out ahead because you got 2/2/1 white flyers, right? So, it's not a disaster, but you do need to keep that in mind, and that does add sort of an interesting kind of downside to these cards with Impending, because there are several turns where you can destroy them before you completely lose the game. All right, so those are the new mechanics in the set. I think they mostly look pretty interesting. I think Manifest Dread is going to be like the sneaky, powerful one that people aren't really that excited about because it just seems like a rehash of what we've seen before. But I think that card select, it's just a way better version of what Manifest was in the past, and I think it's going to perform really well. But I think they all look pretty interesting. It's an enchantment set, it's a graveyard set, and those things make it seem like the format will be pretty interesting. So let's look now at the archetypes. So when I'm recording this, which is on Thursday, we don't have Signpost Uncommons for all of them, but we do have a handy graphic that Wizards of the Coast put out about each of the archetypes. So we know what all 10 are, roughly. Some of the things on the graphic are a little more vague. So let's start out with a look at the 2 Eerie decks. Blue-White and Blue-Black are both Eerie decks, and the graphic says Eerie Tempo and Eerie Control, which, the tempo and control parts are usually what each of these color pairs usually does. And, being an Eerie deck means you're mostly an enchantment deck and you'll get some extra value out of unlocking rooms as well. So let's look at the Blue-White Signpost Uncommon first, which is Inquisitive Glimmer. It's a 2-mana, 2/3, and it reduces the cost of your enchantments and the cost of unlock costs. So, it does exactly, it doesn't say Eerie on it, but it makes it easier for you to trigger Eerie. It makes your enchantments and your doors, which, specifically are an enchantment subtype, it makes those better. So you can see that, this is kind of tempo-y. More than likely the Blue-White Eerie deck is going to be a little more aggressive and leverage Eerie triggers that make creatures into better attackers or get blockers out of the way, stuff like that. Meanwhile, in Blue-Black, you have Eerie Control, and here the Signpost Uncommon is Fear of Infinity. So this set has this interesting sort of pair of enchantment creature types, Glimmers and Nightmares, which are sort of the opposite of one another in the story, whereas, these fears are like manifestations as nightmares of the things you're afraid of, and Glimmers are the manifestation of your hopes. So it's kind of cool that flavor-wise, Blue-Black is like about enchantment creatures and enchantments too, but it's about the nightmares, and Blue-White is about hope and stuff like that. So Fear of Infinity here is one of these nightmares. It's a 3-mana 2/2 with flying and lifelink, and it can't block, and it has Eerie. It comes back from your graveyard and goes to your hand when you either have an enchantment enter or fully unlock a room. This Signpost Uncommon worries me a little bit. Not because it's too good, because I'm a little worried it's not good enough. It's just so bad these days to play a 3-mana 2/2 that can't block, and you have to recast it every time. It's cool that it's recursive. Having lifelink offsets things a little bit in terms of it not being able to block, but I don't know if it's going to be by enough. So, this doesn't mean Blue-Black's going to be bad, and, I'm not going to be right about 100% of everything in this set, but this Signpost Uncommon underwhelms me. Those words can't block are just so bad and limited. When you're spending this much mana especially. So, but you can see how it's more of a slower, grindy deck that looks to recur its Fear of Infinities and things like that, as opposed to the Blue-White deck, which is trying to power out enchantments and unlock doors more quickly. There are also 2 Delirium decks. We've got Black-Green and Red-Green, which are into Delirium. The Black-Green deck, as you'd expect, is a grindier deck that looks to get value in the long run out of the graveyard, whereas the red-green deck is more interested in getting Delirium to make its creatures into better attackers, to have big old monsters in the mid to late game. So we do have the black-green Signpost Uncommon, which is Drag to the Roots, 4-mana instant that destroys target non-land permanent, but it's got Delirium, and if you have those 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it just costs 2 mana. So, you know, that sounds like a more controlling, slower black-green Delirium deck that is looking to, you know, cast removal spells and stuff like that more than anything. And I'd imagine most of the black-green stuff that has Delirium is the kind of stuff that grinds you out value based on the deck's name, as opposed to one that is trying to make its creatures better, which appears to be what the red-green deck is trying to do. So we have a couple of mechanical themes that are spread out across a couple of color pairs. The rest of the decks in the format are all kind of their own thing. Black-red, for example, is a sacrifice deck. It does have an enchantment flavor in this format where all the cards that say you can sacrifice something also say you can sacrifice an enchantment. Signpost Uncommon here is Disturbing Mirth. So it's a 2-mana enchantment, and when it enters, you can sacrifice another enchantment or creature, and if you do, you draw 2 cards. So if you have something else worth sacrificing when you play this, that's going to feel pretty good, and there are sacrifice payoffs in this color pair as well. And Disturbing Mirth is not only a way to sacrifice stuff, it's an excellent thing to sacrifice, because when you sack it, you get to manifest Dread. So you get a 2-2, you know, think of it like a 2-2 token with upside when you sacrifice this. And that does mean the more Disturbing Mirths you have, the better your other Disturbing Mirths get, because you can sacrifice them to one another. You can't sacrifice it to itself. That would be like way too good if it was 2 mana, 2-2, draw 2 cards for 2 mana, right? But if you can set it up with multiple Disturbing Mirths, it's pretty much going to feel like that, which is pretty crazy. There's also enchantment tokens in this set. Lots of expendable enchantments to sacrifice and creatures. You know, you can sacrifice more than enchantments with these. You know, you do have plenty of creatures to sacrifice too. So black-red, like usual, it's a sacrifice deck, but it does have an enchantment angle that is not always present when we see black-red decks. I already mentioned earlier that blue-red is a rooms deck. This one worries me a little for reasons I've already mentioned, where I think there are too many of these that don't impact the board, and unfortunately, it may not be blue-red's only Signpost Uncommon, but it's at least one of them, and they gave us a door that's red on one side and blue on the other. The red side doesn't do anything except make it easier for you to pay to unlock doors, which, you know, matters, but it's like really narrow. And then the Misty Salon side, like, if blue-red decks work, this Signpost Uncommon will be good, because the Misty Salon side can give you, and will give you, even when it's on its own, a creature token with flying. I'm just worried that the amount of mana that these cost and the unlock costs, like, a lot of them, the ones, like I said earlier, that are going to be very clearly good and limited are the ones that have, like, a cheaper side that does something reasonable for the cost, and then another side that you sink mana into in the late game when you don't have anything else to do. Like, those are the ones that are going to feel good. I'm worried about one like Smoky Lounge, which is so narrow. Like, yeah, I get that the door theme is the thing with blue-red, but I just wish it did something else in addition to giving you mana that makes it easier to do stuff with rooms. It does mean it'll be easier to unlock the Misty Salon side, like, you know, that matters, but I'm a little skeptical of blue-red if I have to be. I mean, it's the deck I'm the most concerned about in this format in terms of actually making it work. If they give us enough good common doors, you know, like we do have the one that's a bounce spell and the one that does 4, like if there are more of those around, maybe it works out, but I'm pretty skeptical of like an all-out door deck. Green-white is basically an aggro deck, but it's a survival deck, so this is the color pair that will be the best at triggering survival. We do have the Signpost Uncommon revealed here. It's Shrewd Storyteller. It's a 3-mana 3/3, and its survival triggers that you put a +1/+1 on a creature, +1/+1 counter on a creature. I think that works pretty well with survival, because it makes it more likely you can attack with your other creatures with survival, and you can also sort of snowball it, because if the Storyteller keeps getting bigger, it'll be easier to attack with. But green-white is also likely to have several cards that let you tap down your creatures without having to attack with them, and that might be where the real value is, but you know, I do think green-white is mostly just an aggro deck that has this survival thing going on the side. Blue-green is the Manifest Dread deck. So, you know, there's another mechanical theme. It's only in one color pair, though. We have not seen the Signpost Uncommon for this when I'm recording it. If it has been revealed since I recorded it and in between when I edit it, I'll have it on the screen, but I think it's easy to imagine that It'll make your Manifest Dread creatures better, or just be a card that lets you Manifest Dread as some sort of trigger. So yeah, and like I said, I do think this mechanic is inherently strong because I guess it's not inherently, because if they overcost it, then it's not going to be that good. But when it's attached to creatures that are already reasonable as an into the battlefield ability, or spells that are already reasonable, that's where it's going to be really strong. So you can also imagine there'll be a bit of a graveyard thing going on, because Manifest Dread does stuff with the graveyard. Turning creatures face up, there's probably going to be some bonuses for that. It's hard to say whether this deck will be good or not, because it depends on how they cost Manifest Dread stuff. But from what I've seen so far, I like it. Black-White is a Reanimator deck, another color pair where we don't have the signpost yet. We have seen some reanimation spells, though, at lower rarities in Black and White. And this format also has land cyclers, which, the ones that cost 2 generic haven't performed nearly as well as the ones that only cost 1 generic, for obvious reasons. But I can imagine those being pretty good in this deck. The Black and White land cyclers, cycling them away early and then reanimating them on 3 or 4 is going to be a pretty powerful play. And there's lots of other ways to get stuff into your graveyard. Reanimator decks don't always work in Limited. Sometimes they do. But the tricky thing about them is that you need to be able to load your graveyard, and you need to be able to get creatures in your graveyard that are big enough to be worth spending 5 mana to reanimate. And while I imagine this format is reasonably well set up for that, it wouldn't be the first time that we had a Reanimator deck that wasn't well supported enough and it kind of didn't pan out. So I'm a little skeptical of a Reanimator deck. It's just so much harder than just being well, I just need to mill myself, and it kind of doesn't matter what goes in the graveyard, but I'll get value because of Delirium. That's way easier than being okay, well, specifically, I need to get a big creature in the graveyard, and then I need to draw my reanimation spell. That's harder to line up consistently. Then the last archetype, and this is the one where they were the most vague with the graphic they put out, is Red-White Aggro. I have to imagine there's more than just that going on. There is survival stuff in red and white that will obviously work in any deck that likes to attack. A card like Vicious Clown makes me think a little bit that there is a creature with power 2 or less theme in red-white too. It's not a red-white card, but none of the other archetypes seem to have a theme built around power 2 or less, and that seems like a random throwaway on a common, so sort of imagining that's what red-white's about, and it's a theme we've seen before. It does also work with Manifest Dread, obviously, but the clown isn't blue-green, so it's not there for that deck. So, we don't know for sure, but you can bet that it's a deck that likes to curve out, cast combat tricks, and maybe has some payoffs for having lower power, lower mana value creatures, in addition to the inherent fact that it's just good to curve out like that. So, those are the 10 archetypes, my early thoughts on them from what we know so far, and a look at the mechanics. Overall, I think the set looks like a lot of fun. It's very rare that you look at this stage of any Limited format and you're like, this format's going to be terrible, even though there are people who somehow think they can do that. It's usually pretty hard to tell until you really play with the cards, but right now, I think the archetypes are a good mix of interesting things we haven't seen before and tried and true things. I'm a little skeptical about blue-red and black-white, but the other 8 archetypes all seem like they should be functional to me. We'll just have to see what happens. So, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. Reminder, if you want to get access to my set review-related perks, which include a spreadsheet with all of my grades and my ongoing set review notes, you can become a channel member or a patron. Find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.